This time, Carolyn, if you'll come. It's Mrs. Carolyn Drew.
Well, this makes me very nervous. As you know, I'm a checker in a grocery store. If I was checking your groceries out and taking your money, I'd be all right, but this is something different for me. I was born in a small town about 250 miles south of here called McLeansboro on a rainy evening, October the 14th, 1941. You've heard people say if they had only been born rich. Well, I was. My parents were Earl and Hazel Rich. I have 2 older brothers, 1 sister, and 2 younger brothers. My mother hadn't planned on this large a family, and we are all about 5 years apart, except my 2 oldest brothers, and they are 16 months apart. The first place I can remember living in is a place we moved into when I was about 5 years old and where my mother lived until a few years ago. As a child, I had all the childhood diseases and a couple of unusual experiences. This one I don't remember, but my mother has told me about. I got a potty chair caught on my head, and my dad had to saw it off. Mom couldn't figure out how I got it on my head and asked me why I had put it there, and I told her so I could see how big the hole was. The second one I do remember. My sister and I were going to dress up in Mom's clothes, and I wanted to wear earrings, so I found a key ring and tried to pry it apart with my 2 front teeth. I remember crying and tried to pry it apart with my teeth. The ring got caught in between my 2 front teeth. I can remember crying and wanting a drink of water, but of course I couldn't drink with this thing in my mouth. With this large a family, there were very few dull moments around our house. My dad finally came home and cut the thing out of my mouth. My brother and my sisters are scattered all over the United States. My oldest brother lives in Athens, Georgia, 2 brothers in southern Illinois. My sister lives in Abilene, Texas, and one of my younger brothers lives in San Francisco, California. So we haven't all been together since 1951. As a child, my sister and some friends of ours all went to a Baptist church. I can remember wishing my folks would go because the church was mostly made up of families. But after asking several times, we just gave up and went alone. The year I was 7, my oldest brother joined the Army. A few months later, my second brother joined the Navy. My mother, at later years, has had a son in each branch of the service. My sister and I went to youth rallies and church camps, and it was at one of these church camps that I was saved when I was 11 years old. I was baptized in a pond there in McLeansboro. It is all sort of a blur to me because I was so afraid that a big old snake would crawl into the water with the preacher and myself that I was really glad when it was over. The same year, my oldest brother was wounded quite seriously in Korea. It was a difficult week for my family, not knowing how badly he was wounded, and we were closer that week than we had ever been. We finally heard from him saying he was still in the hospital, but was getting along pretty good. And as usual, my family drifted apart again, the way they always had been. The year I was 12 was the most memorable year for me. My kid brother was born, and the latter part of that year, my parents were divorced. My dad has since remarried and lives in Evansville, Indiana. My mother has never remarried and still lives in McLeansboro. My sister graduated high school and went to work at Wilmette, and I went to church a while after she left and then quit going. I have regretted that several times because at that time in my life I needed the church very badly. My freshman year in high school, I met 3 girls who became very close friends of mine. That friendship has lasted through all the years. I went to work as a car hop in a drive-in restaurant, and soon after that, all 3 of my girlfriends went to work there, and we really had a lot of fun. About 2 years later, I met my husband. He would come into the drive-in with his buddies of his. He was like no other boy I had ever met before. He was a smart aleck and never seemed to care about anything or anybody. He was always into something. Anything ornery that happened in town, everybody said Herb Drew was in on it, and he usually was. He was quite a ladies' man and had went with several girls there in town. All of the girls he had went with thought he was a real catch and all wanted to go with him again. But he didn't impress me, so I didn't have too much to do with him. One night, my friend Janet and I were sitting in the drive-in on our night off, drinking a Coke and listening to the jukebox. Herb and his buddy Bert came in and sat with us. We talked for a while, and they asked us to go riding around with them. I wanted to go with Bert, so off we went, girls in the back and boys in the front. After riding around a while, we were getting pretty low on gas, so we decided to go out to an old oil well and get some drip gas. In the process of getting the drip gas, I got my jeans wet and had to sit in the front seat with Herb by the heater so they could dry. Janet and Bert got in the back, and from then on, when we all went anywhere together, Herb and I was always together, and Janet and Bert were together. They later married also. There wasn't anything to do in our little town, so we would make up our own fun, and we really thought of a lot to do. This went on for about a year with Herb and I fighting and breaking up, but finally the last time we broke up and got back together, we decided we wanted to get married. My family disapproved of this very much, for they had heard how wild Herb was, and they didn't think we could make a go of marriage. Now they think as much of him as they do any one of us kids. But I saw a lot of good things in him and wanted to get married, so finally they saw they couldn't change our minds, so they gave in. But Herb and I had different ideas on what kind of a wedding we would have. He wanted to go across the state line and get married in front of a justice of the peace, but I wanted to be married in a church with all my family and friends there. So finally, we were married November the 22nd, 1958, in the same church I had attended as a small child with all of our friends and family. My family said it would last 6 months, but we are soon approaching our 20th year. Herb was laid off at Caterpillar when we were married, but about 2 months after we were married, he was called back to work, and we moved to Peoria. We lived up here about 4 months, and he was again laid off. So we moved back down south because rent and everything is cheaper down there. Just a couple of months before our daughter was born, he was called back to work, and we moved back to Peoria, and Kathy was born at Methodist Hospital on December the 4th, 1959. He worked for a while and was again laid off, so back down south we went. We bought the taxi service there in McLeansboro, which we owned for about 2 years. Our son was born there on November the 1st, 1961. The cab business was a very demanding business if you were to make a living in it. Herb was always gone, and I was always home answering the phone in the shortwave. Things weren't going too good for us. Herb's brother, who was stationed in California with the Air Force, came home for a visit and wanted us to move to California closer to him and try and start a new future. So after a lot of thought and prayer on my part, we sold our business, packed our kids into a rented car that we drove to California for a dealer, and said goodbye to our families and headed for a state 2,300 miles away on October the 22nd, 1963. We moved into an apartment in Vallejo, California that Herb's brother had rented for us, and Herb went to work at Caterpillar in San Leandro, about 30 miles from Vallejo. Later we found an apartment in Oakland, about 5 miles from Herb's work, and moved in on November the 22nd, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. We really changed a lot that first year. We really began to depend on each other. I was very homesick that first year, and we went home on the train for a visit, but McLeansboro was no longer home for either of us, and we couldn't wait to get back to California. We had moved into a 3-plex apartment before we went to McLeansboro for a visit, and while we were gone, a young couple moved into the apartment behind us. We became friends real soon, and they were always asking us to go to church with them. I worked Sundays and couldn't go, but Herb started to go and take the kids. I probably would have noticed a change in him, but I didn't see very much of him as he worked second and I worked days, so we mostly corresponded with notes throughout the week. But the Lord was working with us, and the property where the restaurant sat that I worked in was sold and the restaurant was closed. We all began going to church, and soon after, Herb was saved and I rededicated my life. Our lives really changed after that. The couple that lived behind us later returned to their home state of Michigan, but we still keep in touch. We later bought a home in Newark. We joined a church where later both of our children were saved and baptized, and we made many Christian friends. In 1967, the kids and I went to Hawaii and spent 13 days with Janet and Bert, the couple we'd ran around with. Herb's brother and his wife were stationed there with the Air Force also, and all of them knew the island real well, so we really had a beautiful time and saw all the points of interest. As our kids began to get older, California was beginning to get bad as far as dope and things, and our family was beginning to get older, so we decided things would be better if we sold our home and moved closer back to this area. So after much prayer and tears, we left our friends and a state that had been home to us for 8 years and moved to Abilene, Texas. We bought a home and 5 acres of land. We had planned on opening a wrecking yard, but things didn't work out that way. Church and began to make friends. But I hated Texas, the dry barren land, the rattlesnakes, and the tarantulas, of which I killed 8 in our backyard. We both worked, but wages were terrible and there was just no way to get ahead. So after a year, we sold our home, put our furniture in storage, and took a month-long vacation back out west. We later moved to the Peoria area, and Herb went to work at Caterpillar and I went to work for A&P. We joined a church in Creveport, but later left that one and came to Elmridge Baptist, where we've made a lot of friends and where our daughter was married in August of 1976. In the almost 20 years we've been married, we've moved 18 times, either into apartments, house trailers, or houses. I have been in 49 states, and this summer we plan a trip to Alaska, which will be my 50th state. I have been as far east as Maine, as far south as New Laredo, Old Mexico, as far north as Montreal, Canada, and as far west as Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. I have been as high as Pikes Peak in Colorado, and I have seen the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean many times, have been waiting in the Gulf of Mexico, and have seen all 5 Great Lakes. But this is no means the end of our traveling. As soon as our son is out of school and decides what he was going to do, we're going into the Peace Corps. I tell people where all we've been and how many times we've moved. They think we're crazy, but I wouldn't change one thing or do anything any differently than we have done in almost 20 years.
Thank you, Carol.